Okay, so we are moving right along. This next segment is our talks based on cuckoo research. Our first presenter is Jenna Stanek with Western Yellow-billed Cuckoo nest site selection and nest success in restored and natural riparian forests. Jenna, I'm going to hand it over to you. You should be all good.
All right, well, good afternoon. We are moving right along. Hopefully we'll get to the next panel discussion with plenty of time to chat. But anyway, my name is Jenna Stanek. I'm currently an ecologist at Los Alamos National Laboratory, and I'll be talking to you about results from a study on Western Yellowville Cuckoo nest site selection and nest success in restored and natural riparian forests along the lower Colorado River. So I worked on this project while I was a wildlife biologist for the Southern Sierra Research Station. And our results show habitat components that were selected by nesting Western cuckoos in restoration and natural riparian forests, and can hopefully guide the creation, enhancement, and management of riparian forests with habitat conditions necessary to promote nesting of Western cuckoos along the lower Colorado River. So riparian restoration efforts, as Carrie Lynn chatted about, have been established, well, on the lower Colorado River, but riparian restoration efforts have been established in areas within the Western Yellowville Cuckoo breeding range with varying success. And some of the most recent efforts have been focused along the lower Colorado River through the multi-species conservation program, which I'll just shorten to LCR MSCP throughout the talk. This picture on the left is one of the restoration areas prior to planting. These areas were former irrigated agricultural fields. And the planting design originally of the LCR MSCP restoration areas aimed to mimic the natural density of cottonwood and willow recruitment with around approximately 1,800 seedlings per hectare. But not all the restoration areas had this type of planting densities. In order to effectively facilitate conservation of the species through restoration efforts, it is essential to recognize the important attributes of high quality breeding habitat. So therefore, it was our main objective to identify vegetation and microclimate habitat characteristics that influence Yellowville cuckoo nest site selection and nest success at restoration and natural sites. The data was collected from 2008 to 2012 at nests and randomly selected locations within occupied breeding territories. Natural sites were all within the active floodplain of the lower Bill Williams River, which receives occasional monsoonal floods and managed releases from Alamo Dam that indirectly simulate stochastic spring floods. Natural sites were comprised of early and late successional cottonwood willow forest with also a large mix of tamarisk. And this study was conducted prior to the arrival of the tamarisk beetle in the area. LCR MSCP restoration sites are actively managed early successional cottonwood willow stands, typically receiving regular flood irrigation every 10 to 14 days during the breeding season. During the time of this study, these forests were 2 to 7 years old. We found that cuckoos selected nest sites with a greater density of small native trees at both restoration and natural sites. So this graph shows the probability of nest site selection on the y-axis and the density of native small trees, which we defined as 8 to 23 centimeters dBH, and it's per 10 meters squared. And that's all on the x-axis. Sorry, did I say the probability is on the y-axis? I don't know if I said that right, but hopefully you're following me. The likelihood of a Western cuckoo placing a nest at a location within a natural site, which is the top graph, increased 6.6 times with every one increase in small native tree per 10 meters squared. And this is of either cottonwood or Gooding's willow. So in naturally occurring riparian forests in our areas, the groundwater depth and surface flood dictate the distribution and density of willow and cottonwood establishment and growth. So for our study, it may not be the species of tree, but rather the density at which they were growing. And I don't know, I found this to be similar to what Patty and Kristen mentioned in their talks, that the understory component is important. So kind of the same theme there. Similarly, Western cuckoos were 1.8 times more likely to nest at a location within a restoration site with every increase in one small native tree per 10 meters squared. So just to kind of break this down, at 0.8 probability of nest site selection on the bottom graph, the native small tree density is about 3 trees per 10 meters squared. So that works out to an area where trees are planted in rows of about 2 meters between the trees, and then 1 meter between the rows of trees, if you can picture that. Cuckoos nested in these dense restoration sites as early as 2 years after planting, and the odds of nest placement also increased 2% with every 1% increase in total canopy closure at restoration sites. Another thing to note for our study on the LCR is that for the natural sites, although tamarisk was the most common tree used for nest placement at natural sites, which is 43% of nests, tamarisk nest trees and tamarisk in general incurred within a mosaic of native dominated trees. And there was no support in our top models for tamarisk density at the plot scale, influencing nest site selection, negative or positive. So within restoration and natural sites, nest locations averaged lower mean and maximum daily temperatures and higher mean daily relative humidity compared to conditions at availability plots. The odds of nest placement within natural sites, which is that top graph on the right-hand side, increased 28% with every 1 degree Celsius decrease in mean diurnal temperature. And the odds of nest placement at restoration sites, which is the graph on the right-hand side, the lower corner, at restoration sites, the odds of nest placement increased 22% with every 1 degree Celsius decrease in mean diurnal temperature. So our results show that Western cuckoos selected cooler nest locations at both restoration and natural sites compared to availability plots along the lower Colorado River. And this is a place where nesting birds are exposed to extreme temperatures that often exceed 40 degrees Celsius in July. There are currently no data on whether the preference for cooler nest sites holds true within northern parts of the range of Western cuckoos. And dense riparian forests typically have lower temperatures compared to areas with less vegetative cover, and they have a relatively cooler microclimate. So it's likely a result of vegetation structure and local hydrology, and microclimate might be selected indirectly. So just because cuckoos are selecting for increased small tree density, canopy closure, and cooler temperatures doesn't mean it's good for reproductive success. So we looked at these variables in relation to nest success. Nests located at natural sites had 100% parent success rate. So therefore, we only analyzed data from restoration sites to investigate the influence of habitat variables on nest success. And our results showed that total canopy closure was the only variable in our top model, and it was our top model by far. And the odds of nest success at restoration sites increased 4% for every 1% increase in canopy closure. For microclimate, only mean daily temperatures was found to be important. Successful nests were more likely to have a lower mean daily temperature than failed nests, where nest success odds increased 5% with every 1 degree Celsius decrease in mean daily temperature. To review, our results show that cuckoos select nest sites with greater densities of young native riparian vegetation and have a greater nest success with increased canopy closure. This is a picture of the Palo Verde Ecological Reserve. Oops. Uh-oh. In California, which currently has the largest population of breeding cuckoos on the lower Colorado River and in California. In order to maintain critical nesting habitat for the Western cuckoo, optimal management practices should aim to provide areas with high levels of canopy closure and encourage native tree regeneration to create successional diversity. And these two recommendations can feasibly be attained simultaneously. Now, although increased canopy closure seems to be agreed upon as an important feature for cuckoo nest site selection, there is a lack of current data on whether the preference for native small tree density within other parts of the range of Western cuckoos would hold true. I I also want to mention two other things to consider about these results. First, the prey base was not accounted for in our research, and it's likely a huge factor in influencing nest site selection. And second, these results don't suggest that all the riparian forest needs to be in an only early successional stage to create optimal habitat, but maybe just a portion of their territory. Their territories are large, approximately 20 hectares, and maybe only 1 to 5 hectares would need to be early successional. Our results can be used with adaptive management practices to help maintain critical nesting habitat for the western cuckoo by creating early successional 1 to 4.5 hectare patches of dense riparian forest. And I'm talking like 1,500 to 3,000 trees per hectare, which could be managed asynchronously on a 10 to 15-year cycle, which I thought Patty did a really good job of explaining. And you could do this by promoting natural regeneration through flooding, high density plantings combined with irrigation, or re-entering mature sites. And I'm all talking about areas along the lower Colorado River. Management recommendations, though, are going to be based on where you're doing restoration or forest enhancement. I'm sure, as we all know, not every area can manipulate water distribution due to water rights and drought conditions, but restoration management of riparian forest should be prioritized based on where you can bring water reliably. And that's all I have, so thank you.
Awesome. So we're going to try this again. We're going to hold all questions until the discussion panel, and we might actually incorporate all of the morning discussions, all the morning presenters in that panel. So next up is John Stanek, and they're speaking about cicadas and yellow-billed cuckoos in restored and natural riparian forests. So John, you should be queued up. You can go ahead and share your screen and unmute.
All right. Hi, everybody. This is a brief presentation on yellow-billed cuckoo and cicada study. I believe it's the only talk about yellow-billed cuckoo prey and food resources here. So Jenna convinced me to stick this in there because nobody else was talking about it. This data was collected back in 2010. Some of you may have seen this presentation ages ago. So this data was collected by the Southern Sierra Research Station. Myself, Shannon Mcneill, Diane, Tracy, Jenna, and Murielette Halterman were all involved. And just move on. So resource availability, in particular food availability, affects the distribution of a species, any species. Cuckoos are large prey item specialists. And outside of some auditory cicada counts, which may still be collected during surveys, I'm not even sure about that, to my knowledge, nobody is monitoring the prey base while concurrently conducting cuckoo surveys. And this is a real problem. Food resources are just a vital yardstick that we can use and measure to correlate an area with our species abundance. So yellow-billed cuckoos, what do we know about their prey? Large soft bodies insects seem to be key. Grasshoppers, sphinx moths, caterpillars, also called hornworms, they devastate my tomatoes. We have katydids, we have mantids, we have large lizards and tree frogs, cicadas, the topic of this small study, and other caterpillars. So in this study, which is from the lower Colorado River, Jenna just described some of the information, and so did Carrie Lynn earlier. We looked at cicadas at natural and restoration sites. So we looked at a mean cicada index. So while surveys were being recorded, the surveyors took a few seconds to try to count the number of cicadas that they heard at the survey point. So it's a cicada index of the cicadas present during the survey. And at the end of the survey, we did habitat surveys, and we actually counted the exuvi counts, the cicada exoskeletons that were left on trees as the cicadas emerged from the ground and assume their adult form. So here we can see that the live cicada counts are strongly correlated with our mean cicada index. At natural sites, we found a significantly greater cicada count than at our restoration sites. The restoration sites at this time were, during the time frame of this study, were 2 to 5 years old maybe, and we just had a strong cicada population at the natural areas. Specifically, this is probably largely impacted by the Bill Williams River National Wildlife Refuge surveys, but also some of our other habitat survey, natural habitat surveys as well. So the restoration sites didn't have a significant cicada abundance. And when we look at the cicada abundance at occupied natural habitats and unoccupied habitats and also restoration areas, we find that cicadas abundance is significantly higher at the cuckoo occupied habitat sites in the natural areas, but we found no significant difference at the restoration sites. And here we have the estimated number of cuckoo pairs at natural sites and the restoration sites. So we see a strong correlation here at natural sites, being these black dots, between the mean cicada count and the number of cuckoo pairs identified at natural sites. So we have a strong relationship here. But again, at the restoration sites, not much of a relationship between cicadas and Yellowville cuckoos. And here's probably the most interesting figure of this presentation, is that when we look at nesting dates, the black dots and the red dots here represent the first fledged date of nests. We see that the Cicada Index recorded over time, the cuckoos chose their fledging period to be closely tied to cicada abundance at natural sites only. Now, adult cicadas, they emerge from the ground. They spend a month or two actively trying to reproduce, and then they die. So during our surveys into July, we had a peak cicada abundance where the morning surveys are just deafening with cicadas. And then as you move into July, the cicadas quiet down significantly as they've all hopefully successfully reproduced. So at natural areas, the Bill Williams River National Wildlife specifically, we saw a tight correlation between the fledged dates of the nests and the peak in cicada abundance. And we had one nest that we believe to be a second clutch, and one nestling apparently, I believe one nestling failed, one nestling died, we found it under the nest, and another nestling did succeed in fledging the nest. But down here at the restoration area, we find that the Cicada Index is very low and no real trends. And we found that the fledged dates of nests in this year, and again, I believe this is 2010, shows no real relationship to cicada abundance. So Yellowville cuckoos display a strong relationship to cicadas at our natural sites. And this was back in 2010 when the Bill Williams was still relatively at its peak, and we had a significant cuckoo presence still at the Bill Williams River. No relationship detected at restoration sites between cuckoos and cicadas. However, the lower number of cicadas at restoration sites were not detrimental to Yellowville cuckoo reproduction, as you've seen in some of these other slides. Real quick, we can see that the Bill Williams River National Wildlife, the number of nests found, we found a significant number of nests in 8, 9, 10, 11, and very few nests at our natural site in 2012. But as the Palo Verde ecological sites and Cibola Valley, as our restoration sites matured, we see that the number of nests found and supported by those areas grew significantly. So these restoration areas did not have a large cicada presence at all and far eclipsed the nesting capacity of our natural site by 2012. So this is just a small presentation of what we've learned about one small fraction of yellow-billed cuckoo prey base and prey availability and the resources that they use. And so this clearly indicates that we have a lot to learn. We don't know we have an idea of what they were eating at the restoration areas. If you went out to those areas at night, it was deafening with insect noise. There were katydids and caterpillars, other insects. Diane Tracy might know more than I do about that. She's got a bunch of old black and white grainy images of prey being brought to nests at the restoration areas. But during these times, we were not monitoring the prey base. The LCR MSCP created fabulous habitat for cuckoos at this time, and the intention was not to attract a wide variety of soft-bodied insects, but that's probably what they did. But it's not fully understood because we weren't monitoring those. And to my knowledge, nobody is monitoring the prey. So we've got these vital yardsticks that we need to be measuring along with yellow-billed cuckoos. And prey is definitely an important component to identify, and it's likely site specific. So what occurred at the Bill Williams did not occur 50 miles away at the Palo Verde Ecological Reserve. And we don't have a lot of cicadas in the Kern River Valley. And I'm not sure what's going on in the Rio Grande. Pretty certainly they do have cicadas down there. But so there are differences all over the west, the southwest, for what these yellow-billed cuckoos might be selecting for. So the trick is, and I hope we can discuss this more tomorrow, is how do we start to measure some of these important yardsticks along with cuckoo surveys? Nest monitoring is an option, but it's extremely expensive and time consuming, not very practical. Auditory insect surveys, that's how we got a lot of the cicada data. It worked well for cicadas, but I don't know else. I don't know what else there for auditory insect surveys. Are there other cheap and quick ways to assess the prey while conducting or while a surveyor is at a site? I would love to hear your options, your suggestions. We've been discussing this for years about how we can do this, but many of us are not entomologists, and a cheap and quick way to quantify insect abundance where cuckoos are found or not found would be vital to moving forward with the species. So that's about it. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them, but we can hold them off until tomorrow. I'd love to hear your ideas about prey availability and yellow-billed cuckoos. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, John. We're going to pause the questions. And I actually have the next person. Okay, so our next presenter is Shannon Mcneill with Songs of Yellow-billed Cuckoos.
Yeah, I'm Shannon Mcneill, and I'm going to be talking about some things we've been learning about cuckoo vocalizations over many years of monitoring them, mostly on the Colorado River, but also on the Kern River. And all this work was done while I was working for Southern Sierra Research Station on contracts for the Bureau of Reclamation Lower Colorado River Multi-Species Conservation Program. I just want to acknowledge my co-author Diane Tracy with Southern Sierra Research Station. First, we should define song. Let's define it as any vocalization made by a bird that serves an important function, such as to attract a mate or defend a territory. And today we're interested in mate attraction songs only. And because the purpose of song is not always obvious, we assume that songs used to attract mates will be given most often by unmated birds. Now, birdsong in general, including mate attraction song, has historically been considered a male thing. However, over the past decade, we're realizing more and more that female birds also sing, and sometimes even more than males. This brings us to the yellow-billed cuckoo. We have a secretive forest bird, and the sexes look alike, so they're challenging to study. They can't be reliably sexed in the field. Among their several vocalizations, they give what we know as the cue, and it does seem that it is mostly unmated birds that cue. Hamilton did a good job of describing what a cuckoo looks like when they inflate their throat sac here. And we have a video of a bird that's cooing quietly. So you might not be able to hear it, but you can see the throat bulging as it coos. Back in 1965, Hamilton and Hamilton speculated that the coo might be given by unmated pre-nesting males, which is not a bad guess back in 1965 before female song was even on anyone's radar. But this ended up being fairly widely accepted, although we also have accounts of soft coos given by nesting females. So we're still not sure. What's missing is hard evidence. Holterman tackled this as part of her PhD research and found females coo significantly more than males, debunking the idea that the coo is given by unmated males. But we still have males cooing, and we're still not sure if that's really true, given the difficulty reciting cuckoos. So we're still wondering exactly who coos, and we're also wondering if we can for sure say whether it's a mate attraction song. With that, our objective was to observe a banded population of known sex cuckoos as they coo. We want 100% confirmation on the individual, and we want 100% confirmation on the coon. We were already working on a long-term project under the LCI MSCP, and if anyone wants more details, you can go to their website. We caught as many adults as we could on the breeding grounds, and we were also searching for nests and banded every chick we could get our hands on. Also, 8 birds were captured and banded by our co-workers at the South Fork River, and this work was funded by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Sacramento office. So for all these birds, we took blood and we extracted the DNA and used a universal avian sexing protocol to make sure we knew the sex of all the birds. And then over the years, we tried to recite as many of these birds in the field and also find their nests. Results. We captured and DNA sexed a total of 362 cuckoos, approximately equal numbers of females and males. We also recited equal numbers of females and males. Around 2/3 of all of them were recited. But how many of those were observed cooing? Now first, if we relax this strict requirement to see the bird cooing in the field, what are our results? We actually get very similar results to the previous study, where most cooing birds are female, but some of them are male. Now, if we went to that stricter protocol where we must see the bird cooing, what do we get? We have 61 observations, and they were all female. We never saw a male cooing. So it's looking like the coo is a female-only vocalization. But what about the timing of the cooing? What was going on when these birds were cooing? And here are our results. Of these birds, we found 30 of their nests, and by far the most birds observed cooing were thought to be unmated in this unknown unmated category. We have another 15% in this pre-nesting category, and some of them may well have been unmated at the time. So if we combine these bottom two categories, then we find that almost 90% of all cooing records were by birds that were not nesting. Another interesting result was the 7 observations of birds cooing while they were nesting. And it turned out it's from 4 individuals, and they were all cooing while nesting on other birds' territories. They actually would visit a neighboring nest and coo. And this also explains why we got some previous results, actually when I was doing my master's thesis on cuckoo genetics, which I'll show in this slide. So I was looking at 6 nests in which I had the DNA from the nesting male and female, and all these chicks represented here by blue eggs. I was trying to match these chicks with the nesting males and females. And if I got a match, then I would show green. And if it only matched the nesting male, it should be blue. And if it didn't match either the nesting male or the nesting female, then it's going to show red. So these are my results. We have only 2 of these 6 nests actually had chicks that all matched the nesting adult. We have 2/3 of the nests had multiple parentage, including 1 in 3 chicks from another female and 1 in every 5 that didn't match either the male or the female. So what can we say at this point? I think we can say that the coo is a mate attraction song. It also looks like female cuckoos coo to advertise their fertility or availability, not just to unmated males with which to nest, but also to already nesting males. Let's look at the cuckoo breeding system. First, we have male biased parental care, where the males are tending the nest overnight. This may liberate the females to pursue all kinds of other reproductive strategies, such as evidence have been found of conspecific nest parasitism, as well as serial polyandry, where the females are going off, leaving an active nest to start a new nest with a second and sometimes even a third male, as shown by Holterman. We also have polygyny, as evidenced by the genetics work. And now with this study, we find we have polyandry and polygyny, where nesting females are laying eggs in neighboring nests. It sounds a bit complicated with all these different things going on, so we decided to come up with a diagram which we hope to help explain things a little better. We have a simple population of 4 males that arrive and set up territories. We have 4 females that come along and they're cooing and they meet up with the males and start nesting. There might be some extra females that want to contribute some eggs to these nests, so they're going to coo and find them. And there's nothing stopping an already nesting female from visiting a neighbour and putting some eggs in there, as we think we've found here. And we have the serial polyandry, where a female might go off and start making a new nest with a second male. And also one of these extra females might settle down eventually. There's also this idea of helper males. We're not really sure if they're helper males or just males that are hoping to nest with the female once she's finished. With all this craziness going on, it's easy to forget that probably the most common breeding strategy for a pair is seasonal monogamy, where the same pair stays together throughout the season through multiple nesting attempts. And we do have lots of evidence of this happening. Now, this all could be happening in one population in one breeding season, and probably depending on a number of factors, such as the current sex ratio and local food abundance. With that, I would like to acknowledge again the LCR MSCP for funding almost all of this work, and as well as just multiple seasonal field techs that tirelessly trudge through the forest chasing cooing cuckoos. Thank you.
Thanks, Shannon, for that. Sorry about the glitches in the front. My computer did not like that for some reason. But we got through. So next up, Matthew Johnson will be speaking about identifying Western Yellowville Cuckoo breeding habitat with a dual modeling approach. So Matthew, you should be ready and set up for sharing.
Thanks, everyone. Today I'm gonna present what myself, Jennifer Holmes, and Jim Hatton have developed a Yellowville Cuckoo model. And this work was done primarily in the work that we did on the Lower Colorado River in 2006 and 2007. And what were our objectives were then was to use our models that characterize Yellowville Cuckoo breeding habitat, use the predictive models to select areas for habitat restoration and effectiveness monitoring, and then identify the cuckoo habitat for range-wide surveys, which was the ultimate goal. In 2006 and 2007, when we were doing the work down there, the majority of our birds that we were detecting were at the Lake Mead Delta, which in 2006 we had 30 detections, nests. And before that, really, the birds had never used that area, and the Bill Williams. Now in 2006, everything changed. In 2007, everything changed. The lake dropped about 5 meters. Left that site on the Lake Mead Delta high and dry, and there were no detections of cuckoos and no nests. So everything was directed to develop this model was on the Bill Williams, because we had data from both 2006 and 2007. Now we looked at the entire the Lower Colorado River, and all the other areas, cuckoo numbers were so low that we really couldn't use anything for the model. So everything was emphasized on the Bill Williams. Bill Williams, as you know, at that time in 2006 was the peak of a cuckoo presence and occupancy. The incredible, they had the flooding that through Alamo Dam was created to create a wildlife habitat, and it did its job then. There was plenty of canopy, dense understory. I mean, it was ideal cuckoo habitat. And since then, it declined gradually a lot. In 2017, 18, we saw a lot of die off of a lot of the cottonwood and willow. And then last year, there was a huge fire that destroyed a lot of the habitat, I guess, quite a ways up from the mouth all the way up. And so it's completely changed. And as data presented earlier, there's very few cuckoos in the Bill Williams anymore. But this is what we developed a model off of 2006 and 2007 data. And so what we did, we created the model that uses spatial data used in the modeling was terrain ruggedness, roughness, distance to water, distance to agriculture or cities, vegetation density, which is using NDVI, normalized difference vegetation index, vegetation cover types, what the different cover types were within the areas that we were modeling, and then hydrogeomorphic classifications. And just as far as NDVI, it measures the greenness and vegetation density through satellite imagery. And in this slide, the blue is the highest and the red is the lowest. And that really, the agriculture area usually shows up really high as good habitat. And a lot of the times this was masked out when we applied the models. So we derived additional variables to describe the patch size at multiple spatial scales between 60 and 480 meters, which was the area that we thought was an ideal home range. And we looked at the amount of vegetation density. This sums up the amount of pixels with NDVI of greater than 0.41 within that given radius. Heterogeneity in vegetation density using NDVI, and that measures that variability in vegetation density in that given area. Amount of cottonwood willow cover type, which was the most prominent native in our system, and it sums the area of cottonwood and willow. And then tamarisk, which also was predominant in the study area. Not as much in the Bill Williams, but throughout the Colorado River. And that summed up that the area of tamarisk. And then heterogeneity of the cover types. This measures the variability in vegetation cover types within the given radius. And so patch size and composition are important, of course, and the key characteristics of cuckoo habitat, what we found out was they needed at least that 120 meter radius, 4.5 hectares of dense cottonwood willow habitat. That was that core area. And then they used the 480 meter radius, that's 72 hectares of low heterogeneity and vegetation cover type. And then they needed at least 480 meters of heterogeneity in the density of vegetation. So those are that core area, that 120 meters, and then expanded out to the 480 meter radius areas. And what we found was patch size and composition are important. So each 10% increase in area of cottonwood or willow within the 120 meter radius, that 4.5 hectares, we found that 189% increase in cuckoo presence. And then each 10% increase in the amount of tamarisk, which was a component within our system, vegetation cover within that 480 meter radius, we found a 99.3 decrease in probability of cuckoo presence. So as the increase in tamarisk, we saw a decrease in cuckoo presence. And then each 10%, approximately half acre, increase in dense vegetation within that 120 meters, we saw a 15% increase in cuckoo presence. And then each 1 standard deviation increase in heterogeneity in vegetation density, we saw an increase of 68% in probability of cuckoo presence. So what it really spells out is that heterogeneity is very important. The density of the cottonwood and willow and tamarisk wasn't as important in this system. And so what model outputs includes the map of the entire study area that shows the probability from 0 to 99%. And that 30 by 30 meter area is the Yellowville cuckoo breeding habitat. And that classification accuracy was 75%. So you have a probability map that gives you a wide range of, what is habitat. What is really good habitat is in the blue, or what is poor habitat in the orange and the yellow. And then you can also create a binary map, which is either it's predicted habitat, suitable habitat, or predicted unsuitable. And we had a cutoff in our models that we used was that greater than 40% we used. And through our statistics, we showed that that was where most of the cuckoos were actually occupying habitat. So how to use these models? The use of the predictive models that use our predictive models that characterize Yellowville cuckoo habitat, breeding habitat, to select areas for habitat restoration and monitoring, and identify the cuckoo habitat for those range-wide surveys, as I discussed before. And then we worked with the Idaho Department of Fish and Game in 2015, I believe. And we started looking at what, where cuckoos were using those sites, mostly on the Snake River. And what we did after we created habitat models, they got additional funding to look at a lot of these sites, which they really hadn't done thorough surveys before. We had no idea really what the population was. But once they got this additional funding, they were really able to get out there and look at what's going on. And so we used this predictable suitable Yellowville cuckoo habitat in the study area, and we used the Landsat data, the NDVI, and the GAP data for the vegetation cover types. And we identified areas that are likely cuckoo breeding habitat for additional surveys that they were conducting. This is through Jay's crew. And we compiled and processed all the satellite imagery data, NDVI, the gap data. We applied the cuckoo habitat model in the study areas that they were going to do surveys, and we mapped the Yellowville cuckoo habitat. And this is an example of the continuous model that was produced. Again, that's that. There's all the detections right up here, and then you can see in the blue where and the green is where the habitat exists, and the yellow and the orange is where the least habitat exists. And so this is this area, again, this is this continuous model. This is the area of interest that they were doing the surveys. And we then additional analysis, we used a binary map and had that 40% threshold. So greater than 40% probability equals presence, and less than 40% was not suitable habitat. And then we used GIS to calculate the amount of habitat cells within that 480 meters, 72 hectares, surrounding each 30 by 30 pixel in the study area. And we created a map that depicts the high quality large habitat, that 480 meter surrounding each pixel. And we overlaid that historic cuckoo records, which were which were minimal. And then and the cuckoo locations of the black dots, and they fell in within that highest quality habitat. And then this was given to the crews to use to prioritize areas that they were going to survey. And I have kind of fallen out of this project. I know that Jim Hatton, who's on this call, is still involved, and Jay, I know, is still involved, and how the model is working for these guys to use for their surveys. I haven't seen those results, but this is a model that can be used on a range wide, and I know that there's additional funding right now to actually look at cuckoos in all these various areas, and this model can be applied in that capacity. And I think that's it.
Great, awesome, thank you so much. So we're gonna just cut into lunch we're gonna try to make a 15-minute Q&A with all the presenters that presented this morning. So presenters, at least unmute yourself. And if you are able, please show your videos. And we do have quite a few questions. So I'll just start by asking a couple of the ones that came in earlier, and Kristen and David, just let me know if you already answered these in the chat, and we'll move on to the next one. Okay. So I believe you answered Ruth, Kristen. Bill Orr asked any observations on food resources in the two reaches.
That one I answered in the chat as well, but in short, for anyone who didn't see it, no, we don't really have food observations as part of our research right now. A few kind of incidental ones, but we do not have focused research on food resources at the moment.
Great, thank you for giving us short and sweet. And then this one, mainly just a comment. Okay, David, let me know if you answered this one. Yes, I'm also thinking about how the patterns are related to food, but if habitat is better in the San Marcial reach, why would they need to move greater distances?
Right. No, I haven't handled that one. And honestly, Kristen's probably better to field that question. She's been more involved with some of the telemetry stuff.
get in?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think if I remember part of it, she was kind of saying, you know, if habitat's better in the southern reaches, why are they moving more? Implying that, you know, if there is more food, for example, they should theoretically have smaller territories. And I think the answer to that is that there's more than food that goes into what makes habitat suitable for cuckoos. So for example, when Shannon was giving her talk, if you think back to her last slide, she was talking about there's all this data on various types of polygamy within cuckoo populations. In the southern San Marcielo reaches, we have many more territories kind of packed in there. We have no data on it at all. I'm just totally kind of thinking about the question, but it is a good chance that the birds are moving around a bit more between territories and there might be more polygamy, whereas in those northern reaches, it's much lower bird density overall, lower cuckoo density, and likely less of that kind of territory overlap and movement between territories. Additionally, if you just think about a cuckoo migrating onto the breeding grounds, what they're kind of looking at, you might presume, might be overall habitat structure, not necessarily how much food is there when they arrive on the breeding grounds, right? And kind of the bird's eye view of habitat from a migrating individual, that kind of southern habitat just structurally looks much better. So we kind of have this concentration of birds there. So I certainly think that food is an incredibly important aspect of this. And it would be kind of interesting to know a little bit more about what's going on in our system. But I think kind of the short answer to that question is there's just a lot more driving habitat preferences than food alone.
Awesome, thank you. And I have this written down for David, but I think either of you maybe could answer this. Has anyone incorporated riparian adjacent habitat into occupancy models?
Not that I know of. I mean, I know it's been discussed, and you know, I think Kristen and I are both big fans of the idea that it's very important what is outside that riparian corridor, because I mean, just anecdotally looking at our survey results and that kind of thing, you know, areas where we don't find too many birds, you've got that real kind of isolated, you know, floodplain, if you will, that's got levees and agriculture and subdivisions and everything, you know, outside the levees. And in areas where we find, you know, huge populations of cuckoos, you don't have that. You've got more of a natural either upland or something else, you know, outside of the active floodplain. So there's got to be something to that. And I know, you know, I've had various discussions with folks about that. But I don't know anybody that's, you know, really quantified it or analyzed it per se.
Yeah, we looked at it on the birdie, and we, you know, really showed, I mean, it came out significant that where the cuckoos were using the riparian zone, the adjacent mesquite habitat was, I mean, was key for them to occupy that.
Yep.
And so that, and you know, our sites were limited as far as what that habitat, because there's so much urban development and agriculture, but every time that mesquite, and even on the San Pedro too, that was instrumental, is that mesquite habitat adjacent to it.
Yeah, I found that in my work on the San Pedro in the 2001 to 6, that they were using the areas that had that adjacent mesquite hackberry habitat significantly. I also want to mention that Steve Lehman and I both did work on the Sacramento River in the 70s and 80s, and we didn't model or track this, but there definitely seemed to be there were lots of huge walnut orchards at the time, and that seemed to be somewhat of a predictor of whether birds were using the adjacent riparian habitat, and they were nesting in those walnut orchards at that time. Again, practices have changed since then, so that may not be a factor, an important component now, but that was definitely something we observed back then.
And you know, you guys were in the Rio Grande Valley, you know, there's so much agriculture, but you know, but the birds are still using those sites. And because I wonder if it's out of desperation. It's interesting they're even using that lower quality habitat. And it's interesting what's going on in Rio Grande. I don't know what else explains their presence. What's driving that, as far as I guess other than food. This could be a key issue.
No.
Well, I mean, the areas we find, a boatload of birds, again, up there in the middle Rio, are in the Bosque del Apache and then down in the delta of Elephant Butte Reservoir. Both of those don't have a whole lot of, adjacent anthropomorphic land uses. And then down there in the lower Rio, yeah, as Miralette, hinted to, it's kind of the elephant in the room. Nobody wants to think about, like, what if we got a bunch of cuckoos in these, big pecan orchards? But to a certain degree, I don't know what the heck else they're using in some places.
I'm interested in how, there's been this discussion about territory. What is defined as a territory? I think we've all kind of used our own interpretation, but Dave and Kristen, what are you guys using as your definition of territory?
Well, I mean, we basically follow we kind of concocted our own guidelines before the survey protocol came out, and they more or less align with what's in the survey protocol, multiple detections over, multiple survey periods within a certain area. And then.
So you guys are using that still, then that's cool.
Pretty much.
Yeah, we use the service guidelines for that.
Okay.
Yep. And obviously kind of, best biological opinion and looking at where those detections are in relation to, the river channel and breaks in habitat and all those kind of things. I mean, that does factor in, but yeah, bottom line, we're still using those, the services guidelines.
All right. So I have a question for Jenna, which is, someone might have missed this bit, but are there data on the relationship of age at breeding, but times habitat times nesting success? Are first breeding season birds nesting in what we consider lower quality habitat, and do they experience lower nesting success?
I did answer that via direct chat.
Nice, good.
I don't know if you want to go to the next one, or I could, if anyone else cares. I mean, I was just saying that our small tree density is a proxy for age, at least for our study that I presented on. So we're assuming that, these younger DBH trees are early success, are representing early successional habitat, but they're probably also providing like that understory structure that Kristen and Patty touched on as well.
I think Hira had an interjection.
Okay.
Hey, Jenna, I was asking not about the age of the stands, but the age of the birds. I was trying to figure out if the first season. So like, we're talking about, this birds are using habitat that we're not considering to be truly suitable habitat. And I'm saying, or some of those birds may be younger birds, first year birds. And so when we're talking about what is preferred habitat, what is the highest quality habitat, is some of that information, we tease out some of that information when we look at different ages of birds. Does that make sense, Jenna?
Yeah, that makes sense. No, I did not look at that data. I don't have that data, but Shannon and Diane have that data and might be able to answer that question.
Okay, Shannon, I don't know if you want to, but we'll just give you a second to think on that. And Kristen, I have one more for you, and I think we might have to break for lunch after that. Kristen, have you looked at cuckoos on the Bosque del Apache since they've been doing habitat restoration in that area?
Yeah, we do survey the cuckoo populations on the Bosque del Apache. Is the question in reference to the river realignment or?
Oh, I think they're talking about all the tamaris they've taken out. I mean, in the last.
Maybe.
I think, I don't know.
Maybe more on the refuge proper. So we do not survey
David,
refuge itself. That is actually handled by the service and kind of some of their volunteers. we just survey in the active floodplain. So I actually can't speak to the refuge itself. Maybe Jenny Davis, if you're on, I don't know if that's something you could speak to, what's going on the refuge.
Well, and they have done some restoration over the years in the active floodplain. You know, there was that channel widening project that took place 10 or 12 years ago. We haven't looked specifically at cuckoo locations in association with the locations of those particular projects. But we're certainly doing surveys, you know, in conjunction with the channel realignment and some of that current restoration that's going on. And, you know, it's so recent, nothing's even happened in there as of late. But it will be interesting to see kind of overall how that, you know, impacts the habitat in the northern half of the refuge.
Yeah, and I think at least the places I'm thinking of that you're referring to, Dave, are kind of in the southern end of the Bosque del Apache, where they've just cleared all of that salt cedar understory.
Right.
And from the surveys we've done, that's still kind of now this gallery cottonwood with no understory, and we don't have very many detections there at all.
Yeah, when I was there was back in the early 90s, and they were doing a lot of habitat restoration then. Again, salt cedar removal. So I was just wondering if looking at different age stands and stuff like that.
And I don't have much to add to it either. They haven't had big booms in birds there recently. They don't have a lot.
Awesome. Shannon, I don't know if you wanted to interject on what Jenna was saying.
Yes, sorry, my computer packed it in, and anyway, I jumped on a different one. And so, yeah, I would say that all adult cuckoos, which are second year on, are nesting, we found. And if we would look at the age, with almost all nests, we don't even know who the adults are. So it would be a very, very small subset. But yeah, it would be interesting to look at. Imagine, you know, young birds are less experienced, so they probably do have higher nest failure than the smarter, whatever, wiser, older birds. Good question, though.
Uh-oh.
Got it. So I'm going to call break time, lunchtime. If anybody has any follow-up questions, we can write them in and I can try to get them to our presenters, probably via email. But yeah, lunchtime, everybody. We'll meet back at 1:30.
Sounds good.
Thanks a lot.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.